War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J.M. Dillard. Chapter 20. A great force struck Harrison in the back, hurling him face down into the grass. The Geiger counter went flying. A heavy weight pressed down on him, keeping him pinned. He tried to call Suzanne's name, and couldn't. The wind had been knocked out of him. He could hear her muffled cries as she struggled. "This is it," he told himself, feeling more frustrated than frightened. And damn awful about the fact that he'd let her come along. And her poor daughter. At least Norton would figure out what had happened. But would he be able to get proof to Wilson in time? "Promise not to scream, and I'll take away my hand." A man's voice, low and soft and very far away. Suzanne's moaning stopped. At the same time, the pressure against Harrison's back disappeared, leaving a dull ache. Slowly, Harrison rolled over and sat up, holding the injured spot with one hand, not knowing exactly what to expect next. He squinted at the vaguely familiar, sneering face looming over him in the darkness. These were no aliens. "Well, I'll be goddamned," Harrison said with something less than pleasure. "Iron Horse, what are you doing here?" Nearby, Suzanne glared at a large, formidable-looking soldier dressed in battle fatigues, his face smeared with black camouflage paint. Iron Horse straightened. "No, Doctor, that's my line. What are you doing here?" He extended a hand and jerked Harrison to his feet. Harrison groaned and rubbed the offending spot in his back. "Jesus, I think I bruised a rib. That is, you bruised it." He scanned the ground quickly in search of the Geiger counter. "Damn it, Colonel, if you hurt any of our equipment, the Army will pay for any damages." Iron Horse's black eyes glittered with amusement, making Harrison hate him all the more for his damnably smug attitude. "You still haven't told me what you're doing here." Harrison ignored him for a moment, stepping over toward Suzanne and her war-painted assailant. "Suzanne, did this joker hurt you?"
"Only my dignity,"
she answered dryly, and gave the camera a pat.
"Fortunately, this is still in one piece."
Harrison turned back to the colonel. "I'm not going to answer your question, Colonel Iron Horse, because you wouldn't believe us if we told you." Iron Horse considered this, and handed Blackwood back the still buzzing Geiger counter. Harrison brushed the dirt off it. It seemed to be okay. "You're right," the colonel said. "I probably wouldn't. I had the tape you gave me analyzed. Remember the one? With the transmission supposedly made by the terrorists? 20 minutes of the best of Buddy Rich." Harrison smiled coldly. "It's not my fault your people couldn't do their jobs, Colonel." Iron Horse narrowed his eyes and started to speak, then seemed to remember something. He glanced down at his watch and addressed the soldier. "It's time, Sergeant." The soldier nodded and disappeared quickly into the dark forest. Harrison watched him go. Where's he headed in such a hurry? He had a dreadful premonition that he hoped was wrong. "Good thing we stopped you before you made it down, or you would have been right in the middle of the fireworks," Iron Horse said casually. "We're about to secure the area."
You can't do that!"
Both he and Suzanne spoke at the same time, almost crying it out. Iron Horse smiled with irritating superiority. "Ah, but we can, doctors. You're both very privileged. You're about to witness a rare event, and live to tell about it. Delta Squad in action. Anytime, any place, any objective. My men are the best." Harrison had heard of them all right, but he shook his head. "If you value your men, Colonel, call them back. You have no concept of who or what you're dealing with." Iron Horse cocked his head and shot him a curious look. "Just a few terrorists with small arms, and poorly defended perimeter. I figure my men are overprepared." Suzanne moved closer, leaning toward the Native American to hiss.
"You don't understand.
It's not just terrorists you're fighting. Harrison put a hand on her arm to silence her. After their last encounter, Iron Horse no doubt thought him crazy, and any explanations would be considered the ravings of a couple of lunatic scientists. The man would see soon enough for himself. She turned toward him angrily. And what happens when all his men are killed? Excuse me, Dr. McCullough, isn't it? Iron Horse asked lightly. Suzanne glanced up at him. It doesn't matter to my men whether they're fighting terrorists or, something else. His expression was enigmatic. Jesus, Harrison thought. He knows. Perhaps the colonel wasn't as dull-witted as he'd first believed. Harrison and Suzanne exchanged surprised glances. Iron Horse was still talking, this time to Harrison. I still remember the look on your face when you saw those empty barrels, Blackwood. Harrison raised a brow at that and said cautiously, And just how experienced are you at fighting those things, Colonel? How much do you know about the first time they did battle with us? Iron Horse shrugged. Enough. I know they don't have their ships or their weapons. Without those, my men will make mincemeat out of them. And have your men been told who they're fighting? Suzanne's tone was cold. The terrorists had weapons, Harrison pointed out. They overran an army installation, killed every soldier in there, and the aliens overtook them. Iron Horse sighed as if weary at having to explain such elementary things to such ignorant people. You have to remember, we're engaging in pure speculation here. I won't believe they're really aliens until I see it with my own eyes. I'm certainly not going to say anything crazy to my men, particularly something crazy I can't back up. I keep my suspicions to myself. Otherwise, my men would lose faith in my judgment. And knowing the shock and confusion they'll experience when they find out who they're fighting, Harrison retorted, you expect them to be able to win? Absolutely. You obviously don't know jack squat. He glanced at Suzanne. Excuse me, Doctor. About Delta Squad, Blackwood. Aliens or not, whatever's down there, doesn't stand a chance. You're making a horrible mistake, Harrison said softly, feeling helpless as he thought of the young soldier who had just left. If there were only something he could do to stop it. Iron Horse checked his watch. Now, he said. Behind the shelter of a tall pine on the outskirts of the farm, Reynolds stood silently gazing at his watch. At the instant the digits changed to 1900, he motioned right and left for his men to move forward. He was aware of a sense of exhilaration, of the rapid-fire drumming of his heart, of the thought of Arlene, and a sudden panic. How would she feel if something happened to him? But Reynolds, though still young, had seen enough combat to ignore such sensations. Like his role model, the Colonel, Reynolds had long ago adopted the motto, "Don't think, act." At the moment, his mind was too focused on what came next to worry about analyzing his own feelings. He dashed to a vantage point from which he could see both the farmhouse and the barn, to be sure his men were in position. They were ready. The entrances to both buildings were covered by soldiers wearing gas masks. Reynolds raised an arm to signal two riflemen several yards in front of him. They fired off canisters of tear gas into the house and barn. Within seconds, thick white clouds of gas began billowing out of both structures. The men positioned near the entrances followed the gas up with a couple of well-aimed concussion grenades. The ground vibrated with the explosions. A pane of glass still left in one of the farmhouse windows shattered, sending glass flying onto the porch. Those who weren't wounded were due to come rushing out, coughing and gagging. Any second now. It was time. Reynolds blew 3 short blasts on the whistle around his neck, then dropped it and pulled down his gas mask. He charged forward. Meanwhile, the soldiers began storming the buildings, some jumping through windows, others kicking down doors. Clutching his M16, Reynolds ran to the barn entrance. The tear gas was beginning to clear only slowly. It was still too thick inside the barn for him to see anything except the backs of his men as they disappeared into the fog, and the vague outline of the tractor-trailer. Reynolds smiled grimly. They were here all right, and he'd like nothing better than the chance to get even with those monsters, after seeing what they did to the soldiers at Jericho Valley. But there was still no sign of anyone fleeing the house or barn. No sound of gunfire, just a strange, vibrating humming sound, as if someone were chanting. Reynolds raised the rifle and waited. Hashran climbed up the ladder into the gray shadows of the loft, where most of the recently revived soldiers rested against bales of hay. The advocacy and their attendants camped inside the warmer, more spacious accommodations of the old farmhouse, but Hashran thought he could have remained with them in comfort due to his high rank, preferred to camp with his soldiers. Flanked by Khira and Konar, Hashran stepped forward where he could be seen. There was a rustling as some of them tried to rise at the sight of their supreme commander. Sounds of surprise from others who did not recognize and did not trust Hashran in his human form. The supreme commander raised an arm in a clumsy approximation of a Mortaxan gesture. "Rest," he told them in their native tongue, for none of them had yet taken host bodies. He paused to look them over. At least 30 dark forms. No more than that, Hashran had insisted, for he would not release more soldiers than he had adequate supplies for, despite his desire to overthrow the advocacy, were huddled on beds of straw. Some of them rose on their thin appendages to show respect, regardless of Hashran's order. Feeling a deep sense of pride at the sight of them, Hashran said, "I have come not as your commander, but as a fellow soldier, to seek a consensus. I am proud you have survived, for this allows us a second opportunity to secure Earth before our colonists arrive. Yet I grieve, because you and your brothers and sisters who died have suffered much at the hands of the Council. The sight of my soldiers falling beside me has made me bitter. We require enlightened leadership if we are to succeed." He paused to judge the response. All listened quietly, without dissension so far, which gave Hashran the boldness to speak candidly. "The current advocacy is unenlightened," he said. "We must have a new advocate." There were murmurs. A female standing in a far corner of the loft said, "Such talk is sacrilegious, Commander. You put yourself at risk." "I put all of you at risk as well," Hashran eyed her calmly. "You could be punished merely for listening to such talk. All of those who do not wish to hear what I have to say are permitted to leave, without fear of punishment." The female was silent. No one moved. One of the males reclining against a bale of hay asked, "What do you suggest we do, Commander?" "I suggest we retain one member of the ruling class." He did not mention Khana's name, for fear that someone had seen them slip off together into the forest. Best to seem impartial at this point. "And replace 2 members with soldiers, myself and whomever you select by consensus." Whispers. Some silently considered, others looked pleased. But Khor, the commander of a squadron, spoke as he reclined on his bed of straw. "Supreme Commander, I have always bowed to your will, but the advocacy would never agree to such a thing, nor would the council. Such an action is unheard of, letting the military rule side by side with the upper class. Next to Hashran, Konar came to his leader's defense. Our situation is unheard of. The Supreme Commander merely wishes to avoid the errors of the past, errors which came close to destroying us all. Or have you so quickly forgotten, Commander Khor? The military needs a voice in this new world, for this is strictly a military operation. There are only 3 members of the upper class on Earth, yet they rule us all. Should they continue to do so, those 3, who recommended the invasion be launched before our scientists even knew of the danger that awaited us here? It's true, someone said clearly, amid echoes of agreement. The advocacy thought only of its own glory. Khor rose angrily on unsteady appendages. And what do you, Supreme Commander, suggest we do with the 2 deposed members of the advocacy? We all know they will not surrender peacefully. Hashran studied the group. Khor was misguided in his loyalty, but shrewd enough to force Hashran into admitting he must kill the 2 advocates, words that on Mortax would have earned him immediate death, and which on Earth would offend those who were undecided about Hashran's plan. I leave their fate to a consensus, Hashran said evasively. Let all of you decide what is best. I can do nothing without the assistance of the majority. All I ask for now is that you consider my words. This is a new world. Old laws, old taboos are no longer relevant here. What is important now is ensuring at all costs that no more mistakes are made. He paused. Through a miracle, I have my soldiers back. I will not lose them a second time to please the egos of our rulers. Khor took a step forward. And as members of the military, Supreme Commander, you and I are sworn to protect the ruling class with our lives. This is the highest law. Or have you so conveniently forgotten the oath you took? Khor's statement created an almost palpable tension in the room, for each soldier had taken the same pledge to protect the ruling class. Some murmured their agreement with Khor's proclamation of loyalty. Others looked silently to the Supreme Commander for guidance. With disappointment, Hashran realized that it would take both time and political maneuvering to overcome Khor's opposition. And time was the one commodity the invading forces could no longer afford to squander. I have not forgotten my oath, Hashran replied. I, too, am loyal to the advocacy, but my loyalty is to my entire world, to the survival of my people and my fellow soldiers. It runs much deeper. Your focus is too restricted, Khor. We are speaking not of the survival of 2 members of the ruling class, but of the survival of our entire race. Khor had no answer. Hashran could sense the momentum of opinion shift in his own favor. Perhaps there was still a chance of convincing the majority, in which case he would have to assassinate Khor and his followers as soon as it could be arranged. A pity, since Khor was a competent military leader. Before Khor could kill him, anyway. He was about to ask for an immediate consensus, but there was no time. Kira, glancing over the edge of the hayloft, cried out, "Commander, we're under attack." Hashran rushed to her side to see just as billowing clouds of gas filled the barn. On the hill crest, Harrison and Suzanne watched helplessly as the men swarmed into the abandoned buildings. "Colonel, please," Harrison began. "For the sake of your men." But Iron Horse ignored him totally, staring transfixed through a pair of field glasses. Finally, he lowered them and swore softly. "Damn, they're not even here." "Thank God for that," Harrison said fervently. At the same time, it dashed his hopes of getting Wilson's proof. That was a split second before the shooting started. The humming grew louder, then stopped. Expectantly, Reynolds flattened himself against the termite-damaged wood near the entrance, but instead of hearing the sounds of surrender, he detected a sharp, brief whistle coming from inside. He drew closer to the door's edge and peered into the barn. Someone cried out, the sounds of struggle. And then, through the wisps of gas, Reynolds saw chaos. Dozens of huge, shapeless black forms dropped from the rafters onto the soldiers below. In the melee, guns fired, and the whistling sound came again, and whatever was happening didn't look too good for Delta Squad. Reynolds was about to rush in to help out when he saw someone, coming at him through the mist. A man, a stranger. Reynolds stepped back and took aim. The man saw but kept coming. He held an odd-looking object in his hand that Reynolds decided was a weapon. A length of thick wire, weighted at the ends with what looked like mechanical gears. The man staggered, but there was no blood on his dark clothing. Only vague, indescribable filth. "Halt!" Reynolds barked, but the man kept coming. Even in the darkness, Reynolds could see there was something horribly wrong with him. His face was swollen and covered with pus-filled sores and flies. The man started to slowly swing the cable. Revolted, Reynolds fired. The terrorist fell straight onto his back, 2 feet from the entrance. And then, to Reynolds' wide-eyed horror, the man's skin began to bubble and pop, releasing small sprays of pus. It was as if someone had poured strong acid on the body. The skin melted, leaving dark red muscle and bone and gleamingly slick internal organs. Something black and gelatinous had wound itself all around the skeleton and the organs, and when the fizzling stopped, a smoldering pile of bones and nasty-looking black scum remained. Reynolds was still gaping, stunned, when he heard the whistling sound again. Strong wire wrapped itself around his legs and arms, forcing the rifle from his grasp as he dropped to the ground. He flailed in vain, then tried to worm his way toward the M16. He actually managed to get a hand on it, but his arms were pinned so that he couldn't raise it and take aim. From the side of the barn, another man appeared, his face as ghastly as the others, an Uzi balanced on his hip. It was the last thing Reynolds saw before the world exploded. "Reynolds!" Iron Horse dropped the field glasses and dashed down the slope seconds before the burst of automatic gunfire. "No, Colonel, don't!" Harrison reached for him, but Iron Horse was already gone. Harrison squeezed his eyes shut as the man with the Uzi fired at Reynolds. Iron Horse tore down the hill and made his way toward the barn. But he was too late. Reynolds' body was a twisted heap, tangled in wire and old rusted gears. A makeshift bola. "Reynolds," the colonel whispered, crouching over the young soldier. At the sight of him, Iron Horse closed his eyes. The Uzi blast had caught Reynolds in the right side of his face, now a bloody, unrecognizable mass. "You bastards!" Iron Horse stood up. At the same time, the roar of an engine sounded behind him as a rider dressed all in black came speeding out of the barn on a four-wheel ATV. A machine gun was mounted on the handlebars, and the rider aimed it at Iron Horse. Iron Horse roared with fury and fired back his M16. The rider was knocked from the ATV, which flipped onto its back, wheels spinning crazily. The rider's body began to dissolve, bubbling and fizzling, the same as the one Reynolds had killed. But there was no time for Iron Horse to watch. A man and a woman in grotesque, decaying bodies were approaching from the direction of the farmhouse. He fired again, missed. The two fled into the safety of the barn through a side entrance. The colonel peered into the barn as the remnants of the tear gas stung his eyes, making tears stream down his face. The barn was quiet, except for dark, inhuman shapes. If anyone from Delta Squad was still inside, they weren't alive. Damn Blackwood for being right. It no longer mattered to Iron Horse if he lived or not. The way he saw it, he deserved to die with his men. He reached for a grenade on his belt, loaded it onto the attachment on his rifle, aimed it straight into the barn, and fired. The blast made Iron Horse stagger backward. The old building groaned and shuddered as wooden rafters gave way and collapsed to the floor, carrying other dark alien forms with them. "That's right, you bastards. Die!" He slipped another grenade onto the launcher and began to take aim again, when his legs went out from under him, tangled in one of the makeshift bolas. An old man approached from behind the far side of the barn, not as badly deteriorated as the others, but definitely eaten away by radiation. The old gas station owner, some detached part of Iron Horse's mind, realized calmly. What the hell was going on? Was the gas station owner, he corrected himself grimly. At least his hands were still free. He fired the grenade right at the guy's chest when he was still several yards away. The old man caught it in his bare hand like some martial arts expert. Iron Horse knew then he had to be hallucinating. This whole thing was some weird, unbelievable dream. The grenade should have torn the man's hand off, or at least taken a few fingers with it. But here the guy was, holding it. The old man studied the grenade curiously, as if he'd never seen anything like it before. The colonel covered his head with his arms and turned away just before the explosion. "Wait here," Harrison said to Suzanne. He couldn't stand by and watch Iron Horse get killed too. "Oh, no, you don't." She shot him a dangerous look. "You're not going down there, and you're not leaving me alone." "Look at him!" Harrison pointed. Iron Horse was struggling to untangle his legs without success. "But you don't even have any weapons." She hesitated, then said, "Oh, I'm going with you." "No way. 1, you've got the kid to think about. 2, you've got the camera. You alone can convince Wilson, and you know it. You've got to survive, or we can all kiss our butts goodbye." "Harrison..." But he was already making his way down toward the battle. "God damn you, Blackwood!" But at least she stayed put. He had just made it to the bottom of the hill and was headed for the barn, watching as Iron Horse finally managed to free his legs. But at the same time, the colonel was entirely unaware of another man, grotesque, rotting, coming from the barn. The man aimed an Uzi right at Iron Horse. "Colonel!" Harrison shouted, falling to the ground. "The barn!" Iron Horse wheeled around and fired just in time. The man staggered backward and collapsed inside the old building. Harrison started toward the barn again. Before he had taken 3 steps, the colonel was on the ground again, tangled not in one but 2 of the alien's weapons. Unable to raise his arms to fire his weapon, a man and a woman were coming toward him out of the barn. A second man approached from the side near the farmhouse. All 3 were armed with automatic weapons. Harrison swallowed hard. He didn't consider himself a particularly heroic individual, and at the moment it seemed like retreat was the sanest solution. But he couldn't watch another human being, even if it was the despicable Iron Horse, be killed without doing something. He looked around desperately and spotted the ATV resting on its handlebars. He dashed for it without realizing he'd already made the decision to do so. His heart was hammering so hard he couldn't get his breath, but somehow he managed to heave the thing upright and get it started. Iron Horse was still flailing in the tangle of bolas. Harrison roared up beside him, painfully aware that the 3 ghouls had spotted him and were slowly taking aim. "Cut me loose!" Iron Horse bellowed, but Harrison didn't bother to respond, just hooked the weighted end of one of the bolas over the back of the ATV and took off. Iron Horse screeched curses behind him as the terrorists fired. Harrison never looked back, not even when the bullets whined past his ears, until they made it to the top of the incline, back into the safety of the forest. "God Almighty!" Iron Horse swore after they'd stopped, and held still while Harrison cut the wires restraining him with a jackknife. "My backside is bruised to kingdom come and back." "Then we're even," Harrison answered grimly, cutting the last strand and helping Iron Horse free. "Look." The colonel put a hand on Harrison's wrist. "Bruised or not, thanks for saving my butt." "Forget it." Harrison shrugged and did his best not to smile. "Doesn't mean we have to be friends or anything. Come on, we've got to find Suzanne." He ran back toward the place he'd left her. The colonel rose stiffly to his feet and followed. Harrison ran through the forest until he found the area he remembered. There was the boulder Suzanne had sat against. There was the hollow where he'd napped. But there was no sign of life. "Suzanne?" he called. Iron Horse came up behind him and unhooked a flashlight from his belt. Harrison turned to him, worried. "This is the area, isn't it? It's gotten a lot darker since we left, but I could have sworn—" "This is it." Iron Horse switched the flashlight on and swept the beam over the area. "There," he said suddenly. Harrison looked. The light hovered over the Geiger counter and the video equipment, smashed and lying in pieces atop a blanket of pine needles, fighting off a sickening sensation of fear. He cupped his hands to his mouth and shouted, "Susan!" Iron Horse clamped a hand firmly over Harrison's mouth and looked anxiously behind them. "Easy. You'll give away our position." Harrison did not struggle. Slowly, cautiously, the colonel removed his hand. "Come on, Doctor. We can't risk hanging around here. They're probably following. We've got to put some more distance between ourselves and them." "No." Harrison shook his head stubbornly. "We're not leaving without Suzanne. She has to be here somewhere." Iron Horse looked hard at him. "Blackwood, you saw what they did to my armed, trained men. If those things have her, there's nothing we can do. Dying ourselves won't help to bring her back." He reached out to grab Harrison's arm, but the scientist pulled back. "Come on." "For God's sake," Harrison cried as desperation filled him. "We can't just leave her." "Forget her, Blackwood," the colonel snapped, and then looked more softly. "She's had it." He caught hold of Harrison's upper arm with a vice-like grip. This time, Harrison let himself be led away, looking back over his shoulder the entire time for any sign of Suzanne.